Hello, welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched Gringo from 2018. So, for those of you who watched my video from last week, you'll remember that I was talking a little bit about later 2010s comedies and what the state of comedy filmmaking is and has been just in the last few years. Now, also in comparison to a few other things that I've watched, and some that I've talked about, some that I haven't, including like Guns Akimbo a few weeks earlier, and so on and so forth. This is still clearly an area of Hollywood that it's having some growing pains. The era of like gross out or stoner or like those kinds of comedies is entering definitely a waning period. Frankly, I hope they more or less go away completely. And so in order to fill the comedy space, there are some changes that are being made in what is being written and what is being approved, though the tendency for them to be relatively low budget and include some notable actors' names, but nobody of no really impressive performances or expectations. It seems to be the way things are going. Now, this came out in the same year as Game Night, which I talked about last week, but has a rather different take and a rather different outcome. And obviously it's a very different movie, but I think there are some comparisons that are worth making. And in fact, watching this movie is the reason I went back and talked about Game Night. Because comparatively speaking, I think Game Night is the better film. This one definitely rides the edge between okay and pretty bad. And I think what's interesting is this one seems to go even harder at the things that I don't think were very good in Game Night. Now, the cast list on this movie is I would say pretty great. There are some people on this cast who are extremely talented actors. Having David Oyelowo as your lead is, I think, a great choice, generally speaking. I really like Charlize Theron, but she's got this somewhat limited range sometimes. She's her performance tends to dramatically differ based on the director. But she's generally good for a good performance. Joel Edgerton, I haven't actually seen in very much before. And I don't really have a strong opinion on him, but the performance here is not great. However, I'm going to reserve judgment for reasons I'll talk about later. And then a couple of other names, including Tandy Newton, who has been in the industry for a long time and just generally seems to crank out really great performances, even in really mediocre movies. She's a very minor character in this film, and so I can't give too much credit or critique, but she's just kind of okay. But the cast list does not solve a lot of the issues at the core of this film. This film does too much as I talked about with Game Night last week. It does too many things, and it doesn't do any of them particularly well. But it also it seems to lose its core as well. Whereas Game Night had a pretty solid, thoughtful, somewhat meaningful, but a little bit shallow core to work on. This movie has a whole bunch of ideas and none of them are solid. Uh, this is also of note. This is directed by Nash Edgerton, who I think is Joel Edgerton's brother. Um, I have no idea who he is or what else he's directed, but I have nothing particular to say about it. The direction in this movie is competent, and that is basically all I have to say throughout the whole thing. The idea here, again, like Game Night, is pretty solid. You have a main character who's in like an upper middle management position, who is trying to make his way in the world and trying to do the right thing, and ends up in a series of scenarios that are sometimes out of his control, sometimes due to his own mishandling of situations. And for a comedy, that's a pretty good setup. Hijinks ensue. That is the overall arc is mainly our character being assigned to go on a business trip to Mexico to have a brief meeting and then kind of come back. And that's all it should be. But Mexico, in Hollywood's eyes, has become a sort of cultural leverage point for questionably racist shenanigans going on. And I don't have the time nor the serious knowledge to delve into all the problems with the country of Mexico and its drug issues and its governmental issues. But at best, this sort of thing is a reductionist view of an entire country, or at least a segment of a country, and sort of points it out as a dangerous location full of criminals, which is really not great, no matter how you slice it, and no matter if your intentions were good or not. But we're not going to dig too much into that. I'm not that surprised coming out of Hollywood, but it's not ideal. The bigger issue is that this movie sets up a bunch of minor arcs and basically doesn't resolve any of them in ways that are compelling or interesting or give serious growth to any of our characters. It repeatedly threatens to have a bunch of characters have a bunch of growth, but then they kind of mostly don't, except for maybe in the last 5 minutes, there's a few characters that get a little bit of very shallow and very projected growth, or not projected. What's the word I'm looking for? Like you saw it coming from, the 15-minute mark, and at the end they finally have it. So it's the character arcs don't work very well. It's also just trying to do too many things at the same time. Is this a movie about a guy who has a shitty working environment that he's in, or is it about a guy who's in sort of a mediocre job who has a relationship that's falling apart? Or is it about a guy who wants to get revenge on his employer and ends up having a bunch of trouble of his own accord because he's getting himself into trouble deliberately and then it gets out of hand? Or is it about a character growth of trying to learn about or trying to understand and get a better grasp on the realities of the world and try not to live purely based on external pressures upon you to become a person of your own? All of these are questions that are raised by this film, and none of them are really substantially answered. So what do we do with that? Well, unfortunately, I don't think any one of those can possibly stand on its own. All of them are too thin to fully extrapolate into a meaningful movie, even if you shot twice as much stuff and wrote twice as many scenes for any given one of those. it's also hard to care about pretty much any of our characters because basically there are only two characters in the film who are decent people, and both of them seem to be they don't have a lot of agency. Um, our main character is one of them, and the other is a very minor character. And the minor character basically doesn't have any agency because she and the person she's with are on a completely different arc of the movie that only briefly intersects with the main arc of the movie, and basically could be excised from the movie entirely and lose almost nothing. It would just tighten things up if they just removed those two characters and everything they have to do with what else is going on. I'm not going to spoil which actor that is or what it is, but it should be pretty obvious. They set up a second arc, a second group of people, and then they do almost nothing with them. So you could eliminate those people entirely. Then there's our main character, who mostly has a few moments of what appears to be agency in his own life, where he's having these realizations, or finally admitting to himself the things he already knew or things he was already worried about, where he appears to have agency and appears to take charge of his life in some respect, and do something. But everything he does is very quickly squashed. It goes wrong for reasons he couldn't have anticipated. And he's also not that compelling of a character because he seems to be very scattered in his motivations, and even he doesn't seem to be a particularly good person. Now, I don't think that's because he's written not to be a good person. I think it's because he's written so sort of mediocrely and it's scattered in his ideals that you never get a full idea of who he is as a character or who he is as a person. And so trying to follow any motivations that he might have or any ideals he might have beyond this has happened to me, therefore I have had this thought in my head and now I should go ahead with it, that doesn't make for a compelling character, very much of a compelling character. So for the most part, any attempt to exert agency on the story and the things going on around him is stymied because it needs to be in order for things not to fall apart. Now, this doesn't have the game night issue of being completely silly and ridiculous because it just goes too hard. The way that it goes too hard is that it's just doing too many things. And because this is a comedy and structurally they want to keep the pacing relatively solid, not a lot of ups and downs, because you can't really, it's hard to intersperse comedy and action, like I was talking about with The Hitman's Bodyguard. That has that problem. It's hard to keep that comedic pacing up while having really substantial, genuine stakes. So it tends to be a series of, we'll do this thing, it'll go wrong in a slightly silly way, it'll have a sudden ending that leads into the next series of scenes that does the same thing on repeat, until the stakes are raised just enough to sort of bring it around to a conclusion. Again, this whole thing doesn't end up adding up to something that's all that interesting. While there's things that could be said, and even there's a substantial amount more social commentary going on here, but it's very shallow and it's very it's shallow, and it just doesn't, it's not subtle. It's shallow and not subtle. And so you get these scenes where, since our main character is a black immigrant from Nigeria, I believe, in the United States, who's gotten to a certain level of white collar job, they point at the fact that he is sort of in these minority positions, but they don't say anything meaningful about his, like, either the progress that he has made or the progress that he hasn't. And it just sort of falls to nothing, where you could replace him with a black man who was not an immigrant, or a white immigrant, or a just a white American, and it would not change anything about what the movie is or says. In fact, gringo is a term that is used differently depending on where you are, and actually it's not like a universal term in Spanish. It's more of a Central American term, or like Mexican and Central American term. It's not something that's used so much in South America, but it tends to refer not just to an outsider, but to a white outsider, somebody who is like touristy and loud and kind of an asshole, typically is how it's used. And while it's a valid use to call the main character a gringo, it's a little unusual. It's not usually the one that would be used, and the one that would probably be used is used once and never again, for a reason that should be apparent. So there's not there's a lot of ideas going on here, and not a lot of execution, and a lot of slop. This feels like it could have gone through a couple of rounds of rewrites to tighten it up into, like, you don't even actually necessarily, like, aside from that, those side characters that I talked about, you should probably almost assuredly excise them from the film entirely. The rest of the plots could all work together in a meaningful way, but they need to tie into each other, and they need to have meaningful conclusions that lead to character growth. And I don't say that just because, like, every movie needs to have character growth, but like a comedy movie with the structure of how a movie works, character growth is almost guaranteed, because unless you're going for, like, either true absurdism, where you're just like, or something that's like more in the 90s style of, like, making fun of your main character or making them the butt of the joke, whether they're likable or unlikable, the sort of straight comedy protagonist idea basically has to have character growth. Otherwise, there's no reason for them to continue being in situations that are funny, because either that means in their scenes they are either if there's no growth, then that means they either have to be making fun of someone or something, or they have to be made fun of. Typically, this is not a universal, but in order, let's back it up and just look at this movie. The character needs to have growth, and you need to be rooting for him. And there's too many opportunities in this film to go, oh, that's dumb. He's kind of dumb. I'm not really rooting for him in this scene. And then the fact that you didn't root for him that much in that scene seeps into other scenes where it wants you to root for him more, but he's not that compelling a character. So it's a lot of missed opportunity here. David Oyelowo in this is a dramatically better performance and a dramatically more compelling and interesting character than Jason Bateman is in Game Night. Jason Bateman his character growth is goofy and basically should just not have been written. But the movie that surrounds them is so, I mean, obviously it's dramatically different, but the movie that surrounds David Oyelowo is kind of sad and dour, and there's not a lot of comedy, or at least not as much as they seem to think there is, extracted from the scenes that he is in. So we need to be rooting for him as a protagonist to, like, finally win out over the universe around him that's, like, sort of beating on him. And that can be a source of comedy, but it needs to lead to growth. Otherwise, at the end, when they shoehorn in the bit where it's like, and he learned a lesson and had a better life at the end. It's not. Otherwise, it just feels kind of unearned, or at least like it wasn't leading that way. So the movie's interesting. It could be a lot better. It could have some better performances. It could have much better writing. The arc of the story could be a lot tighter, and everything else about it is kind of acceptable. Could be better, but like not overtly bad. So it's just kind of meh all around. I wanted better for it, but it's, I don't know. You could spend your time on worse things. It's not bad. I don't know how I feel on this one. I don't know if I'm gonna come back to it and have thoughts on it in a few weeks or something. If I do, I'll throw it in the comments or something. But yeah, it's just kind of okay, and it feels like a lot of missed opportunity. I don't know. I'm still hoping that comedy movies are still possible, and that we haven't relegated comedy to television alone. And while television comedy these days is better than it's been in a very long time, I don't want that to be the only place for filmed comedy that isn't just stand-up. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been your host, the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.